But now let's look at the earlier data prior to 1990. NASA showed rapid sea level rise from the early 1920s until the early 1950s, and then it got very flat for a couple of decades. The implication of this is that Earth was very warm from the 1920s through the early 1950s. What was happening during this period is that glaciers were melting and the level of the ocean was rising in response. But for about 30 years after 1950, there was very little sea level rise, indicating that glaciers weren't melting and that temperatures must have been cold. So if we looked at a temperature graph, we would expect to see a lot of warmth during this period when glaciers were melting, and we would expect to see a period of cold after the 1950s when glaciers weren't melting and sea level was barely rising. But if we look at the current NASA temperature graph, we see the exact opposite. They show that temperatures during the 1920s were very cold and close to the coldest on record. If temperatures were very cold during the 1920s and warmer during the 1970s, why was sea level rising rapidly during the 1920s and barely rising at all during the 1970s? If the temperature graph was accurate, temperatures should have been much warmer during this period of rapid glacial melting and much cooler here during this time when glaciers were barely melting at all. This graph makes no sense. Ice doesn't lie, but climate scientists do. Now let's look at what temperatures were really like during the 1920s and what they were really like during the 1970s. This global temperature graph was published by the National Center for Atmospheric Research in 1974. It showed a lot of warming and very warm temperatures from the 1920s through the 1940s. This corresponds to this period in the sea level graph when sea level was rising very quickly. But then temperatures dropped sharply and the 1970s were very cold. Thus, there was very little glacial melting and very little sea level rise. So the 1974 temperature graph from the National Center for Atmospheric Research makes sense, whereas the current NASA temperature graph makes no sense at all. NASA shows 1921 as being one of the coldest years on record, when in fact it was actually one of the hottest. There was a record heat wave in 1921 which caused a global drought that starved millions of people. There was a huge amount of hunger across Europe, Russia, and much of Asia. 1921 was the hottest year on record in Texas. There was a record heat wave in the Midwest, and even Alaska was seeing record heat for much of the summer. Before the data gets tampered with by NOAA, the average maximum daily temperature in the United States during 1921 was second highest on record after 1934. And the percent of days above 65 degrees Fahrenheit in the United States during 1921 was the highest on record. 1921 was an extremely warm and persistently warm year. The heat of 1921 was reported all over the world. Famous explorer Stephenson reported that the ice between the North Pole and Alaska was thin and rotten. This means that much of the multi-year ice in the Arctic had melted before the year 1922. Climate alarmists tell us that 100 years ago there was very thick old ice here, but the historical record says that simply isn't true. European glaciers were everywhere receding. The ice fringes of both poles were retreating. The Ross Ice Shelf in Antarctica had retreated 40 miles. April 1923, North Pole melting. Many glaciers vanished. Is the North Pole going to melt entirely? Science is asking these questions. Reports from fishermen, seal hunters, and explorers who sail the seas around Spitsbergen and the eastern Arctic all point to a radical change in climatic conditions, with hitherto unheard of high temperatures on that part of the Earth's surface. The New York Times reported in 1923, many old landmarks are so changed as to be unrecognizable. Where formerly great masses of ice were found, there are now often moraines, accumulations of earth and stones. At many points where glaciers formerly extended far into the sea, they have entirely disappeared. Glacier National Park was melting so quickly in 1923 that experts predicted it would be ice-free in 25 years, or by 1948. The world's record heatwave occurred at Marble Bar, West Australia during 1923 and 1924. They had 160 consecutive days over 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 degrees Celsius. Greenland and Norway were melting very rapidly, and by 1939 it was reported that the glaciers in both countries faced the possibility of catastrophic collapse. Winter temperatures in the Arctic around Spitsbergen increased by 16 degrees from 1910 to 1939. In 1952, America's leading Arctic expert, Dr. William S. Carlson, reported that the glaciers of Norway and Alaska are only half the size they were 50 years earlier. The temperature around Spitsbergen is so modified that the sailing time is lengthened from 3 to 8 months of the year. In 1947, it was reported that temperatures in the Arctic had increased 10 degrees Fahrenheit since the year 1900, and that people living along seashores were in danger of being inundated by rising sea levels caused by melting ice. Dr. Hans Ullmann was the world's leading Arctic expert, and he said that the 10-degree rise in temperatures in the Arctic was an enormous rise from the scientific standpoint. But things changed very dramatically between 1947 and 1970. In 1970, the New York Times reported, "The United States and the Soviet Union are mounting large-scale investigations to determine why the Arctic climate is becoming more frigid, why parts of the Arctic sea ice have recently become ominously thicker, and whether the extent of that ice cover contributes to the onset of ice ages." The 3 coldest consecutive winters in U.S. history occurred during the 1970s. We were in a full-blown ice age scare. It snowed in Miami in 1977.
Climate experts believe the next ice age is on its way. According to recent evidence, it could come sooner than anyone had expected. At weather stations in the far north, temperatures have been dropping for 30 years. Seacoasts, long free of summer ice, are now blocked year-round. According to some climatologists, within a lifetime, we might be living in the next ice age. If an ice age is coming, what can we do to stop it? Nuclear energy might be used to loosen polar ice caps. Sea ice could be melted by covering it with black soot to increase the absorption of sunlight. Dr. Stephen Schneider is a climatologist from the National Center for Atmospheric Research.
Can we do these things? Yes. But will they make things better? I'm not sure. We can't predict with any certainty what's happening to our own climatic future. How can we come along and intervene then in that ignorance? You could melt the ice caps. What would that do to the coastal cities? The cure could be worse than disease. Would that be better or worse than the risk of an ice age?
As Stephen Schneider from NCAR was saying, scientists were talking about melting the polar ice caps to stop the global cooling. That was an idea known as geoengineering, which I'm going to talk about again in a minute. The point I'm trying to make now is that this NASA temperature graph makes no sense. The 1920s were very hot around the world and glaciers were melting. 1921 was probably one of the hottest years on record. And then the 1970s were very cold. We had an ice age scare. Yet NASA shows the 1970s as being warmer than the 1920s. Now let's compare what we know about sea level and melting ice to the 1974 NCAR graph. They showed this period from the 1920s through the 1940s as being very warm, during a time when ice was melting and sea level was rising rapidly. But they show the 1970s as being very cold during the Ice Age scare and when sea level was barely rising at all. The 1974 NCAR graph makes sense, but the current NASA graph makes no sense at all. We've been seeing record cold all over the world. Hundreds of people froze to death in Texas during February. Here in Cheyenne, Wyoming, we're having our coldest February through April since 1929. Last week, the wine grape crop in France largely froze. And every state except for about 5 or 6 is expecting more snow before the end of April. What we're seeing is extremely cold weather,